History was written by kings, but truth had a way of surviving in the darkest corners, in the cold stone passages and forgotten cellars where the powerless were left to rot. She was one of them, voiceless, invisible, scrubbing floors until the night her secret was torn open for all to see. Zero. The northern fortress of Valdemar was not built for comfort. Its walls were thick as a man's reach, carved from mountain granite, and perpetually kissed by the bitter winds that screamed down from the Ash Peak ranges. Every corridor held a chill that lye soap and boiling water could never fully wash away. For Ilara, the cold was simply home. She moved through the queen's private chambers on her knees, working a worn-down scrubbing brush across the hearthstone in slow, deliberate circles. Her breath came in quiet, controlled intervals, small, measured, the breathing of someone who had spent years perfecting the art of being overlooked. In the lycanthrope kingdom of Valdemar, weakness was a mark of shame. But for Ilara, silence was something far worse. It was a cage she had never chosen. She had been mute since childhood. No one knew her origin. She had been found wandering the tree line of the hollow forest nearly 11 years ago, half-starved and hollow-eyed, with no name on her lips and no pack scent on her skin. She had been taken in, not out of compassion but utility. A girl who could not speak, could not complain, could not accuse, could not threaten anyone. She had been assigned to Queen Isolde. "Did I say you could rest?" The voice came like a crack of ice. Ilara had not stopped moving. She never stopped. But she pressed her brush harder into the stone regardless, curling her shoulders inward, making herself smaller. Queen Isolde crossed the chamber in a sweep of ivory silk, her pale gold hair pinned beneath a delicate crown of silver wire and moonstones. She was strikingly beautiful in the way of a blade, precise, cold, and dangerous to touch. Ilara kept her eyes on the floor. She knew things about the queen that no one else did. She had learned them by accident, in the way silent people always learn secrets, by being considered furniture. She knew, for instance, that the faint crescent-shaped mark on Isolde's inner wrist, the one she displayed as divine proof of her bond with King Kalen, had been applied by a backstreet alchemist in the lower city. Ilara had found the vials herself, tucked beneath a false panel in the queen's dressing table. Alchemical ink, enchanted to mimic the coloring and warmth of a true bond mark, because Isolde was not the king's fated mate. Their marriage had been political, forged 5 years ago when King Kalen needed the military backing of House Verlaine to hold the fractured territories together after the border wars. Isolde had manufactured the rest, a well-timed revelation, a fabricated blessing, and a court too desperate for stability to ask too many questions. Ilara had told no one, not simply because she lacked a voice, but because of what she herself carried, hidden beneath the scratchy, high-collared fabric of her servant's uniform. Tracing her left collarbone and sweeping down the curve of her shoulder blade were marks that should not have existed on a scullery maid. They were not tattoos. They were not birthmarks. They were luminous, ancient runes, inscribed not by human hand, but by something far older. The intertwined symbols of the moon's phases and the spirit wolf, rendered in lines of silver that pulsed with a faint heat whenever King Kalen moved within range of her, the marks of the true Luna. Ilara did not understand them. Her memories from before the forest were a shattered mosaic. Smoke, screaming, the smell of burning resin, a woman's silver hair whipping in firelight. Nothing cohesive, nothing she could hold on to. What she understood was the danger. If Isolde ever saw those marks, Ilara would not survive the night, so she covered them, ash and soot and tightly laced collars, head down, eyes down, invisible. "He rides through the gate tonight," Isolde murmured, her tone shifting, a needle of anxiety threading beneath the silk. She turned to the window, looking down at the torch-lit courtyard below. "Draw my bath with heather oil and silver moss extract. I need to be perfect." Ilara stood and gave a small, submissive bow, already moving toward the door. King Kalen. Even the thought of his name made the mark stir, a low electric warmth unfurling along her collarbone like an ember catching breath. She had observed him in stolen, accidental moments. He was a formidable presence, broad through the shoulders, dark-haired, with storm-colored eyes that seemed to carry the weight of every decision he'd ever been forced to make. But it was the quieter moments that had lodged in her memory. She had seen him standing alone on the upper battlements late at night, staring into the dark tree line with an expression of such profound, hollow aching that it had made her chest hurt. He was an alpha leading without an anchor. His wolf was suffering, starved of its mate, restless in a way that rippled through the entire pack's morale. A deep horn sounded from the watchtower. The king had been sighted. Isolde spun from the window, her anxiety crystallizing instantly into imperious control. "If you breathe a word to anyone, not that you can," she smiled thin and sharp, "I'll have you kennelled with the warhounds." Alara was already gone, slipping out the door before the threat finished landing. She descended quickly through the tower staircases toward the kitchens, heart loud in her ears. Even 3 floors below, she could feel the shift in the castle's atmosphere. The heavy, stifling tension that had become ordinary under Isolde's reign was dissolving, displaced by something rawer and wilder. The unmistakable pressure of an alpha's aura flooding through the gates. The kitchens were in full chaos. Roasting meat, wine reduction, the sharp sweetness of spiced bread. Every hearth blazing at once. Marin, the head cook, a broad and thunderous woman who ruled her domain like a general, was conducting the madness with a wooden spoon. "You!" She pointed it directly at Alara. "Forget the bath water. The maids will handle it. I need bodies at the high table. You're pouring wine for the king's company tonight." She shoved an enormous silver decanter into Alara's hands before she could retreat. "And wash your face first. You look like you've been mining coal." Cold panic flooded Alara's chest. She shook her head sharply, stepping back, hands rising in frantic, silent protest. The high table, within reach of the king. The proximity alone would light up the marks like a forge fire. And her scent, she had noticed it shifting lately, growing richer and harder to suppress beneath the ash and lye. A wild sweetness, like rain-soaked meadow flowers, that had no business coming from a scullery servant. "I have no time for this." Marin cut her off with a look. "Pour the wine or face the steward. Your choice." Alara washed her hands and face in the freezing basin, careful, desperately careful, to keep her collar pulled tight against her throat. She pressed the fabric down until the laces bit into her skin. "Please," she thought, directing it somewhere vague and hopeful. "Let the smoke and roasting meat cover everything." She gripped the decanter and walked toward the great hall. The hall was enormous and alive. Hundreds of pack members filled the long trestle tables, noise ricocheting off the vaulted stone ceilings. Chandeliers of black iron blazed overhead. The smells were overwhelming. Ale and roasted boar and wood smoke, and at least 40 separate scents of wolf. Good, Alara told herself. Good, too much noise, too much smell. He won't notice, one serving girl. At the elevated high table on the dais, King Kalen sat at the center. He looked like a man who had just walked off a battlefield and hadn't yet decided whether to be relieved about it. His dark hair was travel rough, a fresh scar cut along his jaw, still pink and raw. His ceremonial mantle sat slightly crooked across his shoulders, as if someone had draped it on him in a hurry, and he hadn't bothered to adjust it. He was watching his celebrating pack with those storm-gray eyes, and feeling nothing. The absence in his expression was startling, even at a distance. Beside him, Isolde was luminous in deep crimson, every detail of her appearance engineered to command attention. She leaned toward the king, placing her fingers on his forearm, murmuring close to his ear. Kalen reached for his goblet and moved his arm. Not a word, not a glance. Just the subtle, absolute withdrawal of someone whose instincts refused a connection their mind couldn't yet name. His wolf already knows, Alara thought, a wave of inexplicable sorrow moving through her. He just doesn't understand what it knows. She approached the dais from the servants' passage, head bowed to her sternum, weaving between the seated courtiers. She stepped up to the king's right side and began to pour. The moment she crossed within arm's reach of him, the runes ignited. Not flame, nothing visible, not yet, but a searing, bone-deep heat that blazed from her collarbone down her shoulder blade, as though the marks were waking from a long sleep. She locked every muscle in her body against the shudder that threatened to move through her. Her jaw clenched. The inside of her lip caught between her teeth, copper blooming on her tongue. Just the wine. Just the goblet. Don't breathe. Don't look up. Just pour. The dark liquid hit the rim of the cup. Kaelin went still. Not the stillness of a man pausing mid-conversation. The complete, preternatural stillness of a predator. Every sense suddenly redirected. She saw his chest stop moving. His shoulders drew back. Slowly, almost involuntarily, his head tilted. His nostrils flared. Beneath the boar fat and the ale fumes and the aggressive cloud of Isolde's heather perfume, something else. Faint, barely there. Like a thread of music heard through a storm wall. Wild freesia. Rain on open ground. Magic so old it had no name. His gaze dropped to the hands pouring his wine. Elara felt it like a hand pressing against her sternum. Her focus fractured. The heavy decanter jerked in her grip. She overcorrected, and a wave of deep red wine arced cleanly over the goblet's rim and landed full across the sleeve of Isolde's crimson gown. The silence that followed lasted exactly one breath. Then Isolde erupted from her chair. "You repulsive little creature!" The backhand came with the full force of lycanthrope strength. It lifted Elara off the ground. She struck the stone dais hard, the decanter clanging away across the floor, wine spreading like a wound. The impact drove the air from her lungs. She lay still, vision fracturing at the edges, cheek blazing where the blow had landed. Isolde stood over her, past restraint, years of suppressed rage finally finding a target small enough to strike. "I will have your hands taken for this." Her voice had dropped into something uglier than a shout, low and vicious and certain. She reached down and seized the front of Elara's tunic, hauling her upright. "You worthless, mute little Isolde!" Kaelin's voice arrived like a stone wall. One word. No elevation in volume. The music stopped. Every conversation in the hall died. Isolde's grip tightened rather than released. "She is nothing." She released Elara with a shove of contempt. Elara's hands scrambled for the table's edge. Her fingers found it, but the momentum was too strong. She went down, and as she fell, the already strained lacing at her collar gave way entirely, the rough fabric tearing in a clean diagonal line from her throat down to her left shoulder. She hit the floor. For a long moment she simply breathed, winded, cheek against the cold stone. Then she became aware of the temperature change on her exposed skin. The hearth directly behind the high table was blazing. Its firelight fell exactly, precisely, unforgivingly onto her bare left shoulder and collarbone. And the marks, no longer muffled by layers of linen and carefully applied grime, roused by proximity and adrenaline and the blazing heat of the fire, came fully awake. The silver runes blazed. They pulsed with a cold, brilliant luminescence that had nothing to do with the firelight. Sharp crescent and howling wolf intertwined, spiraling down from her collarbone across her shoulder blade in a cascade of ancient light bright enough to cast shadows in the opposite direction of the flames. 400 wolves in the great hall held their breath. Isolde made a sound like she'd been struck. She stumbled backward, her face colorless. "No," she whispered. "No, it's an illusion. Dark craft. Someone has enchanted her." Kaelin was already moving, and he stepped over the spilled wine without looking at it. He dropped to one knee beside Elara, his massive frame blocking her from the hall's gaze. She lay still, eyes squeezed shut, waiting for the accusation. Witchcraft, deception, rogue magic. She waited for the guards to be called. Instead, she felt the warmth of his hand, hovering just above her shoulder, not quite touching, as though he was half afraid the light would vanish if he made contact. His fingers came to rest on the curve of the crescent moon. The shudder that went through him was visible from across the room. A sound came from deep in his chest, low, involuntary, profoundly possessive. And every wolf in the hall reacted before their minds caught up. Heads dropped, necks bared, instinct overriding rank and reason. "Who did this to you?" His voice was barely above a whisper, cracked through with something that had no place in a warlord's throat. He wasn't asking about the marks. He was asking about the bruise already darkening across her cheekbone, the calluses on her hands, the threadbare state of her clothing, the ash ground into her skin. Ilara opened her eyes. Kalen was looking at her. The emptiness she had seen in him from across the hall, the grief of 5 years spent leading without an anchor, was gone. In its place was something ferocious and certain and agonized all at once. He stood slowly. He turned to face Isolde. The temperature in the great hall seemed to drop. Guards! The word fell like an axe. Detain the woman who holds the queen's title. Isolde's screaming echoed through the corridors long after the oak door swallowed her. Kalen unclasped his fur-lined mantle and settled it around Ilara's shoulders himself, shielding the glowing marks from the hundreds of staring eyes. Then he lifted her, carefully, as if she were something breakable and rare, and carried her from the hall without a word to his assembled court. He took the stairs to the high tower. He set her on the great bed in his chambers and stood for a moment looking at her, the hard architecture of his expression, doing battle with something it clearly had no training for. "You don't have to be frightened of me," he said quietly. "I know you have no reason to believe that yet." He pulled a chair to the bedside and sat. "I have been walking in the dark for 5 years," he said. "I thought the goddess had simply decided I wasn't worth the mercy." He looked at her steadily. "I didn't know you were here." Tears arrived without her permission. She touched her throat. The familiar, resigned gesture. The apology she had made 1,000 times for a silence that was never her fault. "I know." His jaw tightened. "We're going to find out why." The healer, a soft-spoken elder named Aldrich, arrived within minutes. He examined her throat with careful, glowing hands, and then recoiled as though the magic had burned him. "My king!" His voice had gone pale. "This is not a physical injury. There is no scar tissue, no severed cord." He swallowed. "Her silence is a hex, a blood-binding hex. Nightshade-rooted, old craft. It seals the voice and suppresses memory, designed to ensure she could never speak her name, never recover who she was." Kalen stood slowly. "Who could have ordered that done to a child?" Aldrich hesitated. "The binding carries the signature of House Verlaine's court witch. My king, 15 years ago, House Verlaine led a purge campaign through the western reaches. They claimed to be clearing rogue settlements." He paused. "House Kestner's seat was among the territories burned. Their bloodline was declared extinct." Ilara's breath stopped. "Kestner." The word struck something in the dark behind her eyes. An image surfaced, violent and sudden. Flames consuming carved wooden rafters, a woman with silver-streaked hair clutching her close and screaming at her to run, and on the wall, a banner bearing a silver stag leaping across a crescent moon before the fire took it. She lunged forward and grabbed Kalen's arm. She found the carved wooden post of the bed and traced it with a shaking finger, the outline of a leaping stag. Then she pointed to the runes on her shoulder. Aldrich made a strangled sound. "The crest of House Kestner." He looked at Kalen. "My king, she is not merely your mate." His voice fell to near silence. "She is the heir to the Western territories. House Verlaine silenced the rightful ruler of the West, and then handed her to the queen as a servant to ensure she could never reclaim what was taken." Kalen looked down at her for a long, still moment. "They stole your voice to steal your inheritance." It wasn't a question. He knelt, taking both her hands in his. "The hex can be broken," Aldrich said quietly, "but it will need to be torn through by force. It won't be painless." Kalen didn't look away from her. "It is your choice entirely. Whatever you decide, House Verlaine answers for what they've done. That is not conditional." He held her gaze. "But if you want your voice back, I will stay through all of it." 11 years of silence, 11 years of watching from the edges, of communicating in gestures, of being looked through by everyone who passed her in the hall. Ilara pressed his hands between her own and gave one firm, clear nod. Dawn came cold and pale over the ash peaks. The high council chamber smelled of tension, old stone and fresh anxiety. More than 30 lords and commanders crowded the circular table, the room crackling with the energy of men preparing to argue. Lord Crane, a square-jawed ally of House Verlaine, was the first to slam his fist down. The king has imprisoned his lawful queen on the word of a servant girl's parlor trick, he announced. Whatever that light display was, it does not constitute grounds to throw over a noble house. Lord Verlaine's armies will march if she is not released by midday. I suggest the council recall what the last border war cost us before. I suggest the council recall what treason costs. The voice came from the doors. Kalen entered not in ceremonial robes, but in battle leather, sword at his hip, carrying the quiet and absolute authority of a man who had stopped performing and started deciding. He did not go to the throne. He stood in the center of the room. Isolde Verlaine constructed a false bond mark using alchemical forgery. His voice was even, calm in the way that deep water is calm. She abused a position she obtained through fraud. Her family committed murder against a ruling bloodline, stole sovereign territory, and used dark craft on a child to cover it. He looked around the table. If Lord Verlaine wishes to call that a defensible position, I welcome him to explain it in open tribunal. Empty accusations, Crane shot back. Where is your proof? Where is this girl who cannot even speak in her own defense? She doesn't need you to speak for her. The voice came from the doorway behind him. It was rough with disuse, slightly uneven, as though the owner was still learning the weight of it. But underneath that, something else moved through it. Something that made every wolf in the room go instinctively, deeply still. The resonance of a bloodline that had been silent for 15 years, finally finding its breath again. Every head turned. Alara walked into the council chamber. The scullery uniform was gone. She wore deep midnight silk, simply cut, the collar dipping to display the silver runes burning steadily along her collarbone. Her hair, washed free of ash and soot for the first time in years, fell in pale silver gold waves past her shoulders. She moved through the doorway with a bearing that couldn't be taught and couldn't be faked. The deep, settled authority of someone who had finally stopped hiding what they were. Crane's sneer arrived a half-second before his doubt. And who exactly? My name is Alara Kestner. She said it clearly, precisely, like setting a cornerstone. Daughter of Lord Aldrich Kestner, rightful heir and liege of the Western Territories. The room detonated. Chairs scraped. Voices overlapped. Two lords rose to their feet simultaneously. But Alara raised one hand, unhurried, certain, and the noise collapsed. 15 years ago, she continued, her voice steadying with every sentence, House Verlaine burned my family's seat under cover of a rogue hunt. They found a child in the cellar and made a calculation. Kill me outright and draw the curse of spilled innocent blood, or silence me so completely that I would never be a threat. She let the room hear every word. They chose the hex. They threw me into the forest to die of exposure, and when I survived and wandered to this fortress, the queen kept me as a servant, the rightful heir of the West, scrubbing her floors. She stepped forward. The aura that moved with her was not performed. It rolled through the chamber the way a tide moves, inevitable, enormous, belonging entirely to itself. It was the warmth and weight of a Luna's blessing meeting the cold authority of a ruling bloodline. And every wolf in the room felt it reach something wordless and fundamental in their chest. One by one, the lords of the council looked down. Crane stood the longest, but the room had already shifted beneath him, and eventually, without allies and without ground, he sank to his knees. Kalen moved to stand beside her. His hand rested at the small of her back, not directing, not supporting, simply present. House Verlaine's titles and holdings are forfeit, he addressed the kneeling council. Isolde Verlaine will be exiled beyond the Dead Creek boundary. The Western Territories are restored to their rightful stewardship, he paused, and the throne of Valdenmore has its Luna. He turned to her. Every hard angle of the Alpha King, the warlord, the grief-carved ruler, the man who had led alone for 5 years believing he would continue to, softened into something quieter and more real. He took her hand and pressed it to his lips. My Luna, he said, low enough that it was almost only for her. I spent 5 years searching for something I didn't have the eyes to see. You were here the whole time. Alara looked at him, the storm-eyed, battered, unexpectedly tender king, and felt something long compressed finally, completely release. She intertwined her fingers with his and held on. Behind them, through the stained glass of the high windows, the morning light broke clean and cold over the mountains. And for the first time in as long as anyone in Valdenmoor could remember, the fortress felt like it was breathing.